In 1929, Wilhelm Reich wrote a long article for the German journal Unter dem Banner des Marxismus and the Soviet journal, that one. The article, which was revised and published as a pamphlet in 1934, was titled Dialectical Materialism and Psychoanalysis. A close reading of this article will discover Reich's position on the question this conference asks: can psychoanalysis be materialist? Situating this article in the history of its three constituent methods, Marxism, psychoanalysis, and orgonomy, Reich's method, we'll discover what is at stake in the answer to that question: can psychoanalysis be materialist? The article is divided into 5 chapters. It has an introductory note at the beginning, and then there's a chapter that describes the materialist discoveries of psychoanalysis, a chapter in which Reich displays how psychological life itself is dialectical, a chapter that situates psychoanalysis in sociology, and then in 1934, towards the end of his Marxist period, Reich added a 5th chapter that explains the role of psychoanalysis in historical materialism, that is to say, in Marxism. The logic of the order of the chapters is significant. First a question is asked whether the method, psychoanalysis, is materialist. Then the gaze of the investigation is shifted from the method to the material, from the subject to the object, as Reich asks if the mind is dialectical. Once the dialectical method credentials of psychoanalysis are posited, Reich walks it over to the field of sociology to consider if it has a role there. Having established that, he then narrows and sharpens his view and posits a partnership for the 2 radical methods, psychoanalysis and Marxism. One of the objections that Marxists in the early 20th century raised about psychoanalysis is that it is a phenomenon of the decadence of the bourgeoisie. Reich responds, quote, "Is not Marxism itself a phenomenon of the decadence of the bourgeoisie? It could never have come into being without the contradiction between productive forces and capitalist productive conditions or relations. But it represented the discovery and hence the ideological germ of a new economic order taking shape in the womb of the old one." Reich holds that, contrary to the Marxist view that psychoanalysis was bourgeois, psychoanalysis was actually the only psychology to have contributed materialist discoveries to the field. He places it in contradistinction to the mechanized conception of psychology where the life of the soul is simply a physical process. This relic of 18th century concepts, widespread in Marxist circles and kept alive by vulgar Marxism. If psychology is to be limited to the organic, physical concepts, then one cannot talk about class consciousness, revolutionary will, religious ideology, etc., until the chemical processes for these have been discovered. Reich writes that Marxist psychology must deal with psychological phenomenon by a psychological method rather than an organic one. In a 1934 footnote, he writes, quote, "It is certainly true that the psychical is a product of the organic and must consequently follow the same laws as the organic. But at the same time, it is the opposite of the organic, and in that function, it develops a set of laws which are its own and peculiar to itself. Only the study of these latter laws has been the task of psychoanalysis, and in the main, this task has been completed," he writes in 1929. According to Reich, the basic structure of psychoanalytic theory is the theory of the drives. It says instincts in the English translation, but he says treatment of the drives. And the most solidly founded part is the theory of libido, the doctrine of the dynamics of the sexual drives. Reich writes that the source, Keller, of libido is a not yet fully understood chemical process in the organism. Above these sources of sexual excitation rises the powerful superstructure, Überbau, of the psychological libido function, which always remains connected to the base and changes together with it both quantitatively and qualitatively. Every aspect of libido is related to the actual life of the child, such as feeding and excreting. There are 2 irreducible drives, self-preservation and sexual drives. All other drives, according to Reich, are secondary formations, for example, will for power, ambition, greed for profit. Reich writes that, quote, "Freud's dictum that the sexual instinct first appears in connection with the instinct for nourishment should be of great importance in social psychology if a relationship can be established between it and Marx's not dissimilar thesis that in social existence the need for food is also the basis for the sexual function of society." Reich then takes up the question of the Destruktionstrieb and the Todestrieb, a destruction drive opposed to the sexual drive, and a death drive opposed to the drive for self-preservation. This looks like a dialectical system, however, Reich has a problem with the death drive because, unlike the sexual drive, it lacks an obvious material foundation. Reich rejects Freud's theory of an organism's drives for dissimulation, decomposition, which Reich calls a matter of formal analogy only. The death drive could be materialist if a real relationship can be found between it and the self-destructive processes in the organism. In Reich's thinking, the death drive is dependent instead on the libido. It is a secondary formation that arises when self-preservation and sexual drives are not satisfied. It is born from the frustration of the materially based drives. Further, according to Reich, the death drive content is unclear. It refuses to be defined. It is not materialist, and that makes it, quote, an easy loophole for idealistic and metaphysical speculations on the life of the psyche. This assessment will form the basis of Reich's split from psychoanalysis and the groundwork for his own mature theory, orgonomy. In orgonomy, symptoms commonly associated with the externally aggressive death drive, such as violence and war, are considered to be secondary impulses, the result of primary impulses forcing their way through the armoring that is caused by societal prohibition of primary drives. Next, Reich writes about the materialist nature of the ego and the doctrine of unconscious repression. The reality principle in whose interest the ego works remains, according to Reich, formalistic unless it makes a full allowance for the fact that the reality principle as it exists today is only the principle of our capitalist, or rather private property society. It imposes upon the proletarian a maximum limitation of his needs while appealing to religious values such as modesty and humility. It also imposes a monogamous form of sexuality, etc. All of this is founded upon economic conditions, end quote. In a discussion of the repression of childhood wishes and drives, Reich writes, thus we can see that psychoanalysis cannot conceive of the child without society. The child exists for it only as a being in society, for Gesellschaftliches Wesens, socialized beings. The social existence is ideologically concentrated. Large portions of it are unconscious. For Reich, psychoanalysis has a complementary task to that of Marxism. Marx's theory of society was obliged to leave the question, in what way does social ideology affect the individual, open, because it was outside its proper sphere. Instead, the answer can only come from psychoanalysis. Reich writes, for the child, the family, which is saturated with the ideologies of society, and which indeed is the ideological nucleus of society, is temporarily, even before he becomes engaged in the productive process, the representative of society as a whole. Thus, in this paper, Dialectical Materialism and Psychoanalysis, Reich posits a necessary critical relationship between, or partnership between psychoanalysis and Marxism. Reich then turns to show that the materialist discoveries of psychoanalysis have revealed the dialectic of the psychological processes themselves. He begins with a summary of the fundamental principles of Marx's and Engels' dialectical materialism, with a lean towards Engels' dialectics of nature. The materialist, quote, the materialist dialectician does not endow matter with what exists in his thought, but directly apprehends through his sensory organs and through his thought the material happenings of objective reality. Thought itself is also subject to the laws of dialectics. Developments of all phenomena, including natural and societal, occur out of an inner contradiction. This contradiction produces a conflict, but this conflict cannot be solved within a given mode of existence. Instead, the contradiction breaks down the present mode and creates a new mode. Nothing is constant. The developed takes a form of a double negation. Reich cites Marx's position that a class that wants to establish its own rule cannot accept the dialectic, because that would pronounce its own destruction. Only the class that will solve the contradiction, the proletariat, can think dialectically. The bourgeoisie cannot. Reich now describes how Freud's discovery of the formation of symptoms depicts a dialectical process. Reich lays out the steps. The socially restrained ego resists and represses the drive urge. This repressed urge then breaks through the repression and appears in the disguised form, the symptom. The symptom contains both the repressed urge and the rejection itself. This contradiction demands a solution. In the first phase, the ego is too weak to resist societal reality, but it is also too weak to completely repress the drive urge. This weakness is, quote, the framework in which the conflict will take place. According to Reich, the ego looks like it's serving the dictates of society, but it's really acting in order not to be destroyed itself. The self-preservation of the ego represses the urge. He writes, thus, repression is a consequence of a contradiction which cannot be resolved under the conditions of consciousness. The expulsion of the urge to the unconscious is a temporary, albeit pathological, solution to the conflict. In the second phase, after the repression of the wish, which has been both denied and affirmed by the ego itself is now changed. It is poorer by one component, the drive, and richer by another, a temporary peace. But the drive continues, having now been affirmed through repression, no longer under the control of consciousness, dammed up through blockage. Its concentrated energy can break through the weakened ego. According to Reich, in this dialectical manner, repression posits its own destruction. The symptom is a double negation, the negating breakthrough of the negated drive. Reich then considers a conflict between the individual and society. He writes, being a social creature, the individual with all his needs is immediately placed in the midst of society. Not only the close society of family, but also indirectly through the economic conditions of the family, of society at large. Reduced to the most simple formula, the economic structure of society through many intermediary links, such as the class association of the parents, the economic conditions of the family, its ideology, the parents' relationship to one another, etc., enters into a reciprocal relationship with the ego drive of the newborn. Just as his ego changes his environment, so the changed environment reacts back upon his ego. In the struggle between the social order and the drives, the individual is the weaker opponent. A change occurs within his psychological structure. The contrast between the inner and outer forces becomes an inner contradiction, and an inhibiting force, the superego, begins to form within the psychological apparatus under the influence of the outside world. Reich writes, what was originally a fear of punishment becomes a moral inhibition, and thus psychoanalysis fully confirms Marx's dictum that social being determines consciousness. That is to say, ideas, aspirations and wishes, moral ideologies, etc., rather than vice versa. What then is the position of psychoanalysis within sociology? Reich sets up his answer with three questions. What were the sociological facts that gave rise to psychoanalysis, and what is its sociological significance? What is its position in the society of today, and what will be its mission under socialism? Reich writes that, quote, psychoanalysis is bound up with a particular stage of social development. Like Marxism, it is a product of the capitalist era. It is a reaction to the ideological superstructure, the cultural and moral conditions of modern man and society. Here Reich posits a historical necessity for psychoanalysis. Earlier in the paper, when Reich was summarizing Marx's dialectic, he wrote that everything that results from dialectical development is objectively neither good nor bad, but unavoidable and necessary. Reich explains the inevitability of the appearance of psychoanalysis in history as follows. The emergent bourgeoisie during its first stirrings challenged the existing morality, particularly in the sexual sphere. However, as soon as it was established as a dominant class, the bourgeoisie re-established its ties to the church, with its regressive sexual morality, including monogamous marriage, chastity of young girls, the damming up of sensuality, and the fragmentation of male sexuality. This repression of sexuality then created its own destruction through the creation of neurosis and the creation of a method to understand and combat that neuroses. Reich writes, at the end of the 19th century, as a reaction against science being the servant of morality and as a portent of the second scientific phase of the downfall of bourgeois morality, a scientist appears within the bourgeois class itself, who claims that the highly nervous state of modern man is a consequence of cultural sexual morality, and that, generally speaking, neuroses are by their specific nature sexual illnesses resulting from excessive restriction of sexual freedom. This scientist, Freud, is ridiculed and outlawed by official science. He is presented to the outside world as a charlatan, end quote. And then, just as Marxism was sociologically the expression of man becoming conscious of the laws of economics, and the exploitation of a majority by a minority, so psychoanalysis is the expression of man becoming conscious of the social repression of sex. Here Reich is positing the history of the development of psychoanalysis itself as a materialist event. However, according to Reich, the bourgeoisie cannot live side by side with psychoanalysis. As the dialectical solution to the problem of sexual repression, psychoanalysis would be a part of a larger rejection of bourgeois society that included voices in the liberal press against the church, youth revolt against the home, socialists challenging capitalism. Consequently, there were splits from psychoanalysis by people who downplay the centrality of libidinal economy. He's thinking about Adler and Jung here. The lay public considered psychoanalysis as a fashionable craze, analyzing each other's complexes, chattering on about dream symbols over cups of teas in the salons, an activity that actually gave them a chance to talk about sex. Meanwhile, inside psychoanalysis, there is also there is also a resistance to taking its potential role in history. The market is favorable for analysis. It has become good business. Reich writes that the analyst's social existence forbids him, indeed makes it impossible for him to proclaim the incompatibility of the sexual morality of our day, marriage, bourgeois family, bourgeois education, with any radical psychoanalytic theory of neuroses. And that, because psychoanalysis, unless it is watered down, undermines bourgeois ideology, and because, furthermore, only a socialist economy can provide a basis for the free development of intellect and sexuality alike, psychoanalysis has a future only under socialism. In the final chapter of the paper added by Reich in 1934, he writes that the task of scientific psychology is the investigation of the psychical structure formation, and that only a psychology which possesses the necessary methods for comprehending and representing the dynamism and economy of the psychical process can be regarded as scientific. Psychoanalysis, he says, is not yet that fully dialectical materialist psychology, but it is the germ from which it can be developed. So he writes that in 1934. Yeah. According to Reich, psychoanalysis, by virtue of its own method, can reveal the instinctual roots of the individual's social activity, and by virtue of its dialectical theory of instincts, can clarify in detail the psychological effects of production conditions upon the individual, the way that ideologies are formed inside the head. To approach the problem of class consciousness, psychoanalysis must have a clear differentiation between the subjective and objective aspects of the problem. He writes that the positive elements and driving forces of class consciousness cannot be psychoanalytically interpreted, whereas the forces inhibiting the development of class consciousness can only be understood psychologically because they spring from irrational sources. And one must be careful not to use psychoanalysis as a means to subscribe to the ideology of political reaction. For example, to think that the revolutionary will is interpreted as rebellion against the father wherever it occurs, including in the sociological sphere. Instead, one must show how the revolutionary will, or lack of it, corresponds to a real situation, and to what extent the lack of it is irrational. Psychoanalysis is a dialectical materialist, but it cannot be applied to all social phenomena because, for example, dialectical materialist chemistry is one thing. Dialectical materialist sociology is another thing. Dialectical materialist psychology is yet another. Reich writes, anyone who argues that sociological questions can be correctly dealt with by psychoanalytic method is saying at the same time, whether he means to or not, that capitalism could be explained by the methods of chemical analysis. What then is a partnership of Marxism and psychoanalysis according to Reich? Quote, psychoanalysis has its proper place within the materialist view of history at the very specific point. At that point, where the psychological questions arise as a result of the Marxian thesis that material existence transforms itself into ideas inside the head. Marx's writings do not focus much on psychology. While he does write about consciousness, he does not work through the mechanisms of that mental function. However, and arguably, Marx does offer the germ of a method in his writings. From Hegel, and according to my own research, from Shakespeare and other literary writings, Marx developed his form of the dialectic. From his study of classical Greek science and from his readings of history and his participation in politics, Marx made that dialectic materialist. One can therefore use the Marxist method to develop a dialectical materialist psychology. However, no one that I know did that. No Marxist succeeded in developing a Marxist psychology until Wilhelm Reich's sex economics. The economics of libido were at the core of psychoanalysis from the start. The libido theory underwent changes as the first psychoanalysts discovered and wrote about the vicissitudes of sexual energy. When the first typography no longer served as an adequate map of the mind, the psychoanalysts worked through a meta-psychological period in the second decade of the century and introduced a new typography which resulted in the fundamental shift in theory signposted by the presentation of the death drive in 1920 and the consolidation of the second typography in the 23 texts, the ego and the id. Reich was present during part of psychoanalysis self-critique and reorganization. However, his focus was more on libido theory and the genitality of neurosis, at a time when psychoanalysts were working more structurally than economically. Wilhelm Reich, who was born and raised on farms in what is now Ukraine, had a very sexualized childhood. At 4.5, he eavesdropped on his housemaid having sex and felt intense erotic sensations. He began sexual play with her soon after. He also engaged in sexual play with some of the farm's horses at 10, and had intercourse with the family cook at 11.5, a daily sexual relationship that lasted for years. His mother was having an affair with his tutor, and Reich was forced by his father to reveal it. His mother soon began a series of attempts to commit suicide and was finally successful. Reich felt a profound feeling of shame for exposing her secret. Reich served in World War I, starting in the summer of 1915. After the war, he attended the medical school at the University of Vienna, graduating in the summer of 1922, living, by the way, about a block away from Freud on Bergstrasse. He was introduced to psychoanalysis by a fellow student, Otto Fenichel, who in January 1919 organized a seminar on sexology. In the spring, Reich attended Fenichel's lectures on clitoral sexuality. Reich's childhood experiences contributed to his attraction to the sexology lectures and Freud's psychoanalysis. He writes, "I was already conscious of these things long before I started to study this science. During my childhood, conscious sexuality was awakened within me, and at the age of 4, through contact with the maid, I imagined sexuality in every glance, gesture, and especially in everything that seemed at all suspicious to me. I have a strong sexual and erotic disposition." In 1921, Reich read a paper at the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society titled On Drive Energetics. In 1923, he read Genitality from the Viewpoint of Psychoanalytic Prognosis and Therapy, and then at the 24th Psychoanalytic Congress in Salzburg, in his paper, The Therapeutic Importance of Genital Libido, he amplified his conclusions that normal sexuality in Viennese culture created neuroses. He reports that his papers were met by misunderstanding and a chilly silence from Freud and the other analysts. However, Reich was given permission by Freud to lead the Vienna Seminar for Psychoanalytic Therapy from 1924 to 1930. One of its regular members was Anna Freud, who would in 1934, along with Ernest Jones and Reich's training analyst Paul Federn, lead the charge to expel Reich from the International Psychoanalytic Association. Reich's insistence on a libido-centered psychoanalysis came at the wrong time in psychoanalytic history. Reich also had formative experiences with class distinctions from both his upbringing as a farm owner's son and as a soldier. He remembers watching his father manage his workers, which included disciplinary beatings, doling out pay to a long line of workers on Saturdays. Reich relates that soldiering was filled with habituation and dulling. He writes, quote, "War reporters and historians surpass themselves in describing the details of the toilsomeness of fighting and dying. I, like most others, experienced war as a machine, which, once set in motion, works senselessly according to its own rules." These experiences would prepare Reich for his encounter with Marx's writings. In July 1927, there was a socialist riot in Vienna, protesting the acquittal of a group of militants who had killed civilians during one of their firefights. During the riot, the Vienna Ministry of Justice was set on fire, 89 demonstrators were killed, and 600 were severely wounded. There were scenes on the Ringstrasse that resembled a civil war. Reich witnessed these events, which triggered the awakening of his political consciousness. He began to study Marxism. He enrolled in the Arbeiterhilfe, a medical group affiliated with the Austrian Communist Party. And by autumn of that year, Reich was lecturing to the University of Vienna medical students on the sexual plight of the masses. In 1928, Reich delivered a second lecture to the Vienna students on the relationship between Marxism and psychoanalysis. At the same meeting, a Russian psychologist, who had also been invited to talk, declared the entire psychoanalytic theory fiction, and worse, un-Marxist. A year later, on 12 December 1929, Reich gave a talk on the prophylaxis of neurosis to the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, which met at Freud's house, where the topic of discussion was the relationship between civilization and neurosis. Reich held that neurosis could be prevented through cultural change, given that different forms of upbringing, family life, social organization could be introduced. Freud opposed Reich's paper, holding instead that culture takes precedence, and that it was not the task of psychoanalysis to save the world. These VPS discussions were the ground out of which Freud's book, Civilization and Its Discontents, Das Unbehagen in der Kultur, developed. Years later, in a 1952 interview with Freud Archive founder Kurt Eisler, Reich says, Das Unbehagen in der Kultur was written specifically in response to one of my lectures in Freud's home. I was the one who was unbehaglich in der Kultur, at unease in the culture. In a 1934 footnote to the Dialectics paper, Reich writes, today, the entire psychoanalytic movement, in large measure because of political reaction, which has grown so much stronger in recent years, is in a situation of acute crisis. The crisis can be described as an expression of the contradiction between revolutionary ideas of psychoanalytic sexual theory and the bourgeois religious ethical view of many of the leading analysts. The principal areas of theoretical disagreement between the scientific, Marxist, and the bourgeois lines within the psychoanalytic movement relate to the origin of sexual repression, the role of genital sexual life in mental health, the existence of a biological self-destructive drive, and certain technical and therapeutic problems. In January 1929, Reich organized Marxist psychoanalysts in a group that he called Sozialistische Gesellschaft für Sexualberatung und Sexualforschung, so that he could apply his sex economic therapy in free sex clinics for the masses. He also opened a publishing project for his work, Verlag für Sexualpolitik. At the end of September 1930, Reich moved to Berlin to continue his Marxist psychoanalytic work with support from the German Communist Party. Reich joined the Red Bloc on Wilmersdorferstrasse, a writers and artists colony led by Alfred Kantorowicz. The same type of Marxists, undialectical ones in Reich's view, who opposed psychoanalysis, also opposed Reich's sex political work. They began to write against them in their official organs, and in 1932 the party prohibited the distribution of Reich's works. In 1933, Reich was thrown out of the communist parties, including the Danish Communist Party, of which he was never a member of. The Nazi SA was also hot on his trail, making it necessary for Reich to leave Berlin. Things were no better back home in Vienna, where Freud asked the International Journal of Psychoanalysis to prefix one of Reich's articles with the statement that he was a member of the Bolshevik Party. During Reich's very productive Marxist period, 1929 to 1936, he wrote this paper, Dialectical Materialism and Psychoanalysis. He also wrote Psychoanalysis in the Soviet Union, What is Class Consciousness, along with many pamphlets for sex economy for the masses. He wrote the books, The Imposition of Sexual Morality, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, The Sexual Revolution. After this period, Reich moved on from both psychoanalysis and Marxism as he transitioned into his biological work, Orgonomy. While these two methods would remain formative to all of his work, Reich bracketed his Marxist period, eventually turning against communism and Marxism, even rewriting his early texts to expunge some of the Marxism. Later in his life, Reich turned to the political right, supporting Eisenhower in the United States and claiming that the Soviets were at the helm of an intergalactic conspiracy against him. Neo-Marxists have since had a troubled relationship with psychoanalysis, and Neo-Freudians a similar one with Marxism. After Reich, there have been attempts to use both methods in the Frankfurt School, in some post-structuralist theory. There was a resurgence of Reichian dialectical materialist theory and practice in the late 60s, both in the US with the radical therapy movement and in Europe. Reich's sex economic work resurfaces at the outbreak of May '68 as the texts that the students were reading at Nanterre when they demanded that the university lift its sexually repressive rules. In the 80s and 90s, a few isolated practitioners were Reichian and Marxists. I'm one of those. Dialectical Materialism and Psychoanalysis signals a very significant moment in history, when Marxism and psychoanalysis could have joined and worked together. What could have occurred in history if Reich would have been successful in his sexual political revolution? How would a sexually alive German population have voted in the 1930s? Could the brief moment of liberation in the 60s have lasted longer if psychoanalysis had been successfully radicalized and Marxism successfully sexualized? What if today we were to go back to the points made in Reich's paper and once again consider a materialist psychoanalysis?